The pill bottle was different again. Elena noticed it the way she noticed everything in this house. Quietly, without moving her head, her hands continuing to wipe down the marble bathroom vanity in slow, practiced circles. Third change in 4 months. The label was the same pale pharmacy orange, the doctor's name printed neatly in the prescriber field. But the medication name had changed. Again. And the dosage had doubled. She set it back exactly where she had found it. Exactly. The same angle, the same distance from the edge of the vanity, the same slight forward tilt. She had memorized these details within her first week. She memorized everything in this house. It was simply how she worked. Downstairs, Mr. Voss moved through his morning with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own version of events. Elena had cleaned for enough wealthy people to recognize that particular quality. It was the ease of someone who understood that reality, for people like him, was not fixed. It was a thing to be shaped, managed, presented correctly to the right people at the right time. She thought about the woman she had first met in this bathroom 18 months ago, Catherine Voss, 43 years old, former architect, a woman who laughed loudly at her own jokes, kept 3 half-finished novels on her nightstand, and moved through every room with the kind of energy that made the air feel different after she left it. Sharp, present, completely herself. She thought about the woman who now sometimes stood at the kitchen window for 20 minutes without seeming to notice the time passing, who apologized for things that required no apology, who moved through her own home like someone who had gradually forgotten she was allowed to take up space in it. Same woman, 18 months apart. Elena picked up her caddy and moved to the next room. She did not allow herself to think yet about what she was beginning to understand. There was still work to do, but she had started photographing the pill bottles 3 weeks ago, and the photographs did not lie. The Voss estate sat at the end of a private road in the kind of neighborhood where the houses were set so far back from the street they could almost convince you they didn't exist. The gates were automated, the hedges immaculate, the gravel raked in parallel lines so precise they appeared machine-drawn. Elena had worked in grand houses before. She understood that the exterior of a wealthy home told one story, the interior told another, and the private rooms behind closed doors told the truth. The agency had described it as a long-term placement. 3 days a week, full household management, complete discretion as standard. The previous housekeeper had left without notice after 11 months. Elena had not been told why. She had learned long ago that the details always revealed themselves without needing to be asked for. Richard Voss met her at the door on the first morning. He was tall, well presented in the effortless way of men who had always possessed money rather than earned it, and he moved through the introduction with practiced warmth. He showed her around the house himself, which was unusual. Men of his position typically delegated that task. He was thorough and pleasant, and made it quietly clear which spaces were his domain and which were not. His home office on the upper floor. His private study adjacent to the master bedroom. These doors, she understood without being told explicitly, were not part of her responsibilities unless he indicated otherwise. The house itself was extraordinary. 4 floors of precision-designed living space, every surface chosen for impact and effect. The kind of interior that had been assembled by professionals rather than lived into organically. Cool, pale tones throughout, marble, glass, brushed steel. Beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful precisely because they do not invite you to touch them. Catherine Voss was in the garden on that first morning, sitting at a wrought iron table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. Elena noticed the cold tea because she noticed things like that. She also noticed the slight hesitation in how Catherine turned toward her when they were introduced, Not unfriendly, but careful. The wariness of someone who had learned to be cautious about new people in her own home. Catherine was striking in person, fine-boned, dark-eyed, with the kind of face that suggested a whole interior life happening behind whatever expression she was presenting to the world. She was dressed simply and well. She smiled genuinely. The pattern she had documented was, in his professional opinion, inconsistent with standard psychiatric treatment protocols. Richard's half was public-facing, controlled, everything in its designated place. Catherine's half was quieter, more personal, books left open on armchairs, a sketchbook on the kitchen island, reading glasses on every surface as if she moved restlessly through the house, following whatever had her attention that day. Two entirely different ways of inhabiting the same space. She filed that observation away and began to work. Elena learned a household the way she learned everything, through repetition, patience, and attention to what changed between one visit and the next. In the first weeks, the Voss house presented as most large, wealthy households did. Complex in its logistics, particular in its preferences, but not unusual in any way that registered as significant. Richard Voss traveled frequently for work and was often absent 2 or 3 days at a stretch. During those periods, the house had a different quality entirely. She cleaned the studio the way she cleaned every room, carefully, thoroughly, without disturbing anything that did not need to be disturbed. But she noticed, she always noticed, and she added each observation to the record she was quietly building in her mind and on her phone. Nothing so obvious as tension or conflict. It was subtler than that. Catherine became quieter, more contained. Her movements became smaller somehow, as if she were taking up a carefully measured amount of space rather than whatever amount she naturally required. The sketchbook disappeared from the common areas. The music stopped. Elena noted these patterns without drawing conclusions from them. Every long-term couple had a rhythm to how they occupied shared space. This was not unusual in itself. What she noticed first, concretely and specifically, was the medication. The master bathroom was part of her regular responsibilities. She cleaned it thoroughly each visit. Surfaces, fixtures, floors, the long double vanity with its 2 designated sides. Richard's side was sparse and deliberate. Catherine's side told a more complicated story. There were the expected personal care items, the expensive skincare arranged in careful order, and there were the prescription bottles. 2 of them initially, then 3 by the time Elena had been in the household for 2 months. All prescribed by the same doctor, all in Catherine's name. Elena was not a medical professional. She did not pretend to understand what she was looking at in clinical terms. But she was a woman who had cleaned for hundreds of households over 15 years, and she had learned to read the physical landscape of a home as a text. The prescription bottles on Catherine's side of the vanity were part of that text. She read them the way she read everything, carefully, without judgment, storing the information without yet knowing what it meant. What gave her pause, initially, was not the medications themselves, but the rate at which they changed. In a typical household, prescription bottles remained consistent for months. A stable treatment, a stable life. The Voss bathroom did not follow that pattern. Every 4 to 6 weeks, something shifted. A bottle disappeared and was replaced by a different one. A dosage changed. A new prescription appeared alongside the existing ones. Elena began to register these changes the way she registered anything that deviated from an established pattern as information worth holding on to. She also began, slowly and without intention, initially, to register the timing. Richard and Catherine Voss did not argue in any conventional sense. There were no raised voices, no dramatic scenes. What happened instead was quieter and harder to name. a particular quality of silence that settled into certain rooms after Richard had been home for several days, a careful, deliberate quality to Catherine's movements in the 24 hours following one of Richard's longer phone calls in his private study. And then, within a week of those silences, something on Catherine's side of the vanity would change. New bottle, higher dosage, different name on the label. Elena might have dismissed this as coincidence, a treatment being adjusted, as treatments legitimately were, if it had happened once, twice even. But by the fourth time she observed the same sequence of events, she had stopped calling it coincidence in her own mind. She said nothing. She was a housekeeper. She cleaned the vanity and replaced the items exactly as she had found them. And she went home and sat at her kitchen table and thought carefully about what she was and was not certain of. What she was certain of, the pattern existed. The timing was not random. The same doctor's name appeared on every prescription label. A Dr. Philip Mercer, with a practice address in the most expensive medical district in the city. What she was not certain of, what any of it meant, and whether it was any of her business. She decided, that night, that she would pay closer attention. That was all. Simply closer attention. She also began, quietly and carefully, to photograph the labels. What Elena observed over the following months was not a single dramatic deterioration, but something slower and in many ways more disturbing. It was a gradual erosion, the kind that happened in increments small enough that each individual change could be explained away, but that accumulated over time into something undeniable. Catherine had always been a reader. Her nightstand held multiple books simultaneously, each with a different bookmark at a different stage of completion. By the fourth month, the books were gone. Not removed, simply abandoned. They sat in neat stacks on the shelves, spines uncracked, as if the part of her that had needed them had quietly switched off. She had maintained a correspondence with several friends and former colleagues, envelopes arriving regularly in the post and being answered within days. By the fifth month, the correspondence had thinned. By the sixth, it had stopped almost entirely. Elena noticed the envelope sitting unopened on the hallway table for days at a time, which was something the Catherine she had first met would never have allowed. The studio was the most telling. That room, with its drafting table and its ordered chaos of rolled drawings and reference photographs pinned to the walls, had been the most alive space in the house. Catherine had worked in it on almost every day Elena had been present in the early months, and the evidence of that work, the accumulating drawings, the evolving projects, had been visible and real. By month 7, the studio door was closed more often than it was open. By month 8, Elena cleaned it without finding a single new drawing on the table. The reference photographs remained on the walls. The projects had simply stopped. She said nothing about any of this. She was a housekeeper. The shift happened in the 7th month, and Elena almost missed it because it arrived not as a dramatic event, but as a very small one. Catherine had been having a good period. Elena had learned to read those too. The weeks when Catherine seemed more like the woman she must have been before whatever process had been quietly operating on her, more present, more herself. She had resumed work on something at her drafting table in the studio. She moved through the house with something closer to her original energy. The reading glasses were everywhere again. The sketchbook was back on the kitchen island. During that period, the bathroom vanity was also notably quieter. One of the prescription bottles had disappeared entirely. The dosage on the remaining ones was, Elena observed from her photographs, lower than it had been 3 months prior. She had begun to understand the architecture of what she was witnessing. The medications were not tracking Catherine's mental state in the way a legitimate treatment would, improving when she struggled, adjusting carefully when she stabilized. They were moving in the opposite direction. When Catherine was well, the prescriptions reduced. When conflict entered the household, they increased. The medication was not responding to Catherine's condition. It was, Elena had come to believe, with a cold and settled certainty, producing it. It was during the good period that Elena found the connection she had not been looking for. She was cleaning the private study. Richard had left for a 4-day trip and had, on this occasion, left the study unlocked, which was unusual. She cleaned it as she cleaned everything, methodically and without disturbing the arrangement of any item. On the desk, face down beside the keyboard, was a photograph. She did not move it. She cleaned around it. But the angle at which it lay allowed her to see enough of the image as she worked. 2 young men in what appeared to be university graduation attire, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something outside the frame. One of them was a younger Richard Voss. She recognized him immediately. She did not recognize the other man, but she registered his face with the same careful attention she gave to everything in this house. That evening, she sat with her phone and the photograph she had been taking for months, and she searched the prescribing doctor's name with methodical patience. His professional profile was thorough and impressive. His educational history was public information. And there, in a listing of his university graduation year, was a name she recognized alongside a photograph she had seen that afternoon on Richard Voss's desk. They had attended the same university, graduated the same year. The photograph on the desk was not a business contact. It was an old friend. Elena sat with that information for a long time. She was not a lawyer. She was not a doctor. She was not an investigator of any kind. She was a woman who cleaned houses for a living, and she had accumulated over 6 months a collection of photographs of prescription labels documenting a pattern that she now believed, with quiet and complete conviction, was not a coincidence and was not a legitimate medical treatment. She was also a woman who understood exactly how much her word was worth against that of a man like Richard Voss. The answer was precise and not comforting. She needed something she did not have. She needed someone with credentials and authority who could look at what she had documented and confirm that what she was seeing was what she believed it to be. She thought carefully about who that person might be, and she thought about Catherine in the studio with her drafting table during the good weeks, and Catherine at the kitchen window during the bad ones, and she made a decision. She began, carefully and without rushing, to research Catherine's history, not her current life. The current life was someone else's construction. Her history before this house. She was looking for something specific, a thread that led backward to a time before the medication and the silences and the careful reduction of a woman into a smaller and smaller version of herself. She found it in an interview Catherine had given 7 years earlier, before her marriage, when her architectural practice had received a regional award. The interview mentioned, briefly, a therapist Catherine had credited with helping her through a difficult period following her mother's passing, a Dr. Anna Reeves, with a practice in the city's east side. Elena looked up Dr. Reeves. The practice was still active. The doctor was still listed. She composed a careful, factual message. No accusations, no conclusions, only a request for guidance from someone who might know Catherine Voss and might be willing to point Elena toward the right kind of help. She sent it on a Tuesday evening and did not sleep well that night. Dr. Reeves responded within 48 hours. She did not confirm or deny any knowledge of Catherine Voss. She was a professional, and Elena had not expected otherwise. But her response was careful and specific in a way that told Elena her message had been understood. Dr. Reeves provided the name and contact information of a colleague, an independent psychiatrist who worked frequently in situations involving questions of appropriate medical treatment. someone who knew how to look at a pattern of prescriptions and understand what they were looking at. Elena contacted him the following day. He asked her 3 questions in his initial response. How long had she been documenting? How consistent was the pattern? And did she have the original photographs or only her descriptions of them? She answered all 3 questions precisely. She had been documenting for 6 months. The pattern was consistent across 14 documented changes. She had the original photographs, time-stamped, stored in 2 separate locations. He asked her to send everything. She spent one evening organizing 6 months of photographs into a clear and chronological document. Dates, medication names, as she had recorded them, dosage changes, and alongside each entry, a brief factual note of the household atmosphere in the days preceding each change. She sent it without commentary or interpretation. She let the pattern speak for itself. The assessment came back 9 days later. It was written in careful, precise, clinical language that Elena read 3 times to be certain she understood it correctly. The frequency of medication changes, the direction of those changes in relation to the timeline she had provided, and the involvement of a single prescribing physician with no apparent specialist qualifications in the relevant areas raised what he described as serious questions, warranting formal review. He had also, Elena noticed, copied the response to a colleague at a medical oversight body. She had not asked him to do that. He had done it anyway. She read that detail twice. Then she sat quietly in her kitchen for a long time. The morning she returned to the Voss house following the assessment was a Thursday. Richard Voss was home. He was in his study, the door closed, his voice audible through it in the measured cadence of a man conducting important business. Catherine was in the kitchen, sitting at the island with a cup of tea, the sketchbook closed in front of her. She looked tired, in the particular way she looked tired during the difficult periods, not physically exhausted, but somehow reduced, as if something essential had been turned down low. Elena cleaned the kitchen around her, as she always did, without disturbing the silence. She wiped the counters, cleaned the hob, emptied the small bin beside the island. She worked with the same unhurried precision she brought to every task in every house. Her face was calm, her hands were steady. She had sent copies of everything to the independent psychiatrist. She had retained copies of everything herself. The documentation existed now in the hands of a credentialed professional who had already involved a formal oversight body. Whatever happened next was no longer entirely within Richard Voss's ability to control, regardless of who he knew and what version of events he preferred. Elena did not know the full complexity of what was unfolding. She did not know the precise timeline of whatever formal process had been set in motion. She was not a lawyer or a doctor or an investigator. She was a woman who cleaned houses and noticed things and had spent 6 months quietly, carefully, and with complete precision documenting what she had noticed. She moved to the master bathroom. She cleaned the vanity with the same methodical care she always brought to it. She straightened the items on Catherine's side. She noted, without expression, that the dosage on the remaining bottle had increased again since her last visit. She set it back exactly as she had found it. Exactly the right angle, exactly the right distance from the edge, exactly the right slight forward tilt. Then she picked up her caddy and moved to the next room. She had done what she was able to do. She had done it carefully and thoroughly, and without a single corner cut. She had finished what she started. In the weeks that followed, Elena continued to show up on her scheduled days. She continued to clean with the same precision. She continued to notice everything. The atmosphere in the house shifted in ways she observed without commenting on. Richard Voss spent more time in his study, his calls longer and less smooth than they had been. Catherine, gradually and then more noticeably, began to seem more present again. The sketchbook reappeared on the kitchen island. The studio light was on when Elena arrived one Thursday morning for the first time in several months. Elena did not know all the details of what the formal process had produced. She did not need to. She could read a household. She had been reading this one for 18 months. What she could see was enough. She cleaned the bathroom vanity on a Thursday morning 6 weeks later and noted, without expression, that there were fewer bottles on Catherine's side than there had been in over a year. The remaining ones bore a different doctor's name in the prescriber field. She set them back exactly as she had found them. Then she picked up her cloth, moved to the next surface, and continued her work. Some houses hide their secrets in locked rooms. Others hide them in plain sight, on bathroom shelves, in prescription labels, in the silence that falls after a door closes. Elena had learned, over many years and many houses, that the truth was almost always there if you were willing to look carefully enough. The wealthy counted on the help being invisible. That was, she had come to understand, their most consistent mistake.